Hello, everybody. Welcome to Let's Be Frank TV1. Today, we're doing Eustace Mullins. I know I got a little bit of followers following me. I promise you it's going to get interesting because I'm going to basically start putting stuff together for you. So, Eustace Mullins is before Alex Jones, before Nick Fuentes, before Stanley Monteith, before any of these guys. This is the guy that exposed the Federal Reserve System, how it really works, what's going on at the end of the day, and he really breaks it down. So I want to show you two different videos of this guy. A lot of people don't talk about him, and it's like, I mean, you're not talking about the guy you learned, like basically like the grandfather of conspiracy theories here. I do want to preface this by saying I don't have any problems with ordinary Jewish people, because I did say in a video, hey, I don't trust anybody, but I don't trust any Jewish person but Jesus Christ. And don't take it personally, Jewish people, because I just at this point in my life don't really trust anybody. I don't care who you are or who you claim to be. You got to earn my trust. So don't take it as a slight. At the same time, I feel like we should be able to investigate with what's going on with the government of Israel. I'm not anti-Semitic. I have Jewish friends. They don't say, hey, you're this, you're that, no, because they just know that I know what's up. And the truth of the fact of the matter is there's good Jews, there's bad Jews, there's Jews that aren't involved, and then there's people of high level power who are doing certain things. And to be not to be able to talk about it and just be slandered as anti-Semitic is ridiculous, especially in the United States. So we're going to jump into this, and you're going to learn from like the master of this. Are you ready?
Control the foreign policy of the United States?
Israel completely controls the United States. In fact, Ariel Sharon, the president of Israel, has said that repeatedly, publicly. It's very seldom picked up by the press. But he says the United States will do anything we tell them to. Not ask them to, but tell them to. Don't forget they put a bill through Congress to control the Internet. And it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because it was totally unconstitutional. There was no justification forever. The Supreme Court represents the occupation government because the government is always an occupation government representing somebody else. The government does not represent the American people because the democracy is supposed to be representative government. Now, Washington today does not represent any American except in a very tenuous way.
Was 9/11 an inside job?
100%. What I called it publicly, I was quoted in the New York Times after 9/11, I said it's a typical government operation. And I don't know anybody that said it better. And that appeared in the New York Times in the Frank Rich column, and Frank Rich printed it, but he didn't offer any rebuttal.
Is it a United States government job, or is it a Zionist inside job?
Well, it's more a Zionist inside job.
Okay.
Because the Zionism is the government in Washington. Everybody knows that.
So the United States government is controlled by Zionists.
Yes. Well, in Congress, have you ever heard any congressman stand up and make a speech denouncing Israel? Well, you won't.
With that said, and these bankers know that, their time could be limited, no
Yes.
matter how much money they got, what would they be capable of?
Well, right now they're capable of staying on top of the current, and they have enough money to buy into anything they want to. So they're trying to keep control. But of course, they have no control over the Internet. Anything can come on the Internet. And so they're just trying to ride it out. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are a very debated document which appeared in the 19th century. And supposedly it's a program by which the Zionists were going to take over the world. The techniques that they would use to do this by controlling communications and education and governments and so forth. And it's a very detailed program for exercising power. And so this document was immediately denounced, and the Zionists denied that it ever existed and so forth. But it was finally brought before a court in Basel, Switzerland, and a judge ruled that the Elders of Protocol of Zion was a forgery. And of course, a forgery is an illegitimate copy, an unauthorized copy of a real document. So the judge's ruling that the Protocols of Elders of Zion was a forgery established that there was a real document somewhere called the Elders of Protocols of Zion, although none was produced. And so ever since then, whenever you mention the Elders of Protocols of Zion, they say, well, that was ruled a forgery by the court in Switzerland. And it was ruled a forgery, which meant that it was a copy of a document that it existed somewhere. I mean, when you forge a check for $100, there has to be an original check somewhere for $100 that you forged. So the Elders of Protocols of Zion is the same thing. The fact that the court ruled that there was such a document meant that there is such a document somewhere and is eventually produced.
Is the CIA controlled by Zionists?
Well, my book, The World Order, has the only history of the CIA. I went through at least 6 histories of the CIA, which were between 800 and 1,000 pages apiece. And from that, I got the entire history of the CIA. And I have it all in 10 pages in my book, The World Order. I'm sorry I don't have one with me. But as I say, this so-called friend carried off a copy about a month ago. I told him, I said, this is my print copy. I got to reprint this book. And he said, I'll get it back to you in a week. And I haven't heard from him in 3 weeks.
Tell me about that. How does that start in your book, and where does it go?
Well, I give the entire history of the CIA, which was formed in 1940 in London by the British General Staff. And the chief architect of the CIA, which was established as a branch of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS of England, which was established by the Bank of England in 1694 and became the best intelligence service in the United States because it had unlimited funds because that was financed by the Bank of England. It was simply a private intelligence agency for the Bank of England, just like the FBI is a private intelligence agency of the Federal Reserve System. When they had the Ruby Ridge Massacre in Idaho, I was traveling there and lecturing at that time. And so I did a talk show, and there was a young interviewer who was asking me about this, and I said, he said, well, what about all these police units that are attacking Ruby Ridge? And I said, those police units are all Federal Reserve police units. And he said, there's no such thing as a Federal Reserve police. And I said, they're all Federal Reserve police. Who do you think pays them? And he cut me off. It's the only time I've ever been cut off on a talk show in my life. The thing went dead.
Do you think people just don't want to know, or they just think, or what?
Well, when you tell them the real facts, they don't want to admit it. And so the only thing is to hang up the phone.
Or attack you.
Well, they do that constantly. Whenever your name, once they hang up on you, whenever your name is mentioned, if somebody says, why don't you have Eustace Mullins on? They said, listen, I had him on, not on this program, and he practically wrecked my whole program. And that's true. I've taken 50 talk shows, hosts off the air in the last 50 years. Never with any intention to do so, but I would say more on the air than they wanted their audiences to hear.
Wow. That's just a taste, guys. That's basically an introduction. Oh, let me stop.
Americans count on us to keep everything running.
Last year, we increased U.S. production nearly 20%.
We're going into the second part right now. And that's just to give you a glimpse of Eustace Mullins. But the most important thing that he did is he was the first person to expose the Federal Reserve System. One second here.
So I met a poet, a very bohemian person named Ezra Pound, who was then incarcerated without trial on a more or less lifetime basis.
I have to do this.
And he asked me to look into the banking interest, the Federal Reserve System, at the Library of Congress there in Washington, D.C. And I did this, and I found it to be quite an interesting story, which launched me on research which continues to the present day.
Now, this book, The New World Order, How does the New World Order deal with the banking interest in America and across the world?
Well, you see, in studying the banking system in the United States, I found it was part of an international system of banking called central banks in Europe, and that the Federal Reserve System, which we had here, was simply an American version of the central banks they had in Europe. And I also found that these banks did not exist as some entity in some world of their own. They were an integral part of what I came to call the world order.
Now, Eustace, this New World Order and this banking system, I was under the impression that the banks themselves were American banks and it was the federal government that owned the banks. Are you telling me that our government itself doesn't own these banks?
Well, our government doesn't own anything. We really don't have a government. We're just a colony of England.
How can you say that, a colony of England? Well, I know that they have the Republican Party and the Democrat parties, and I go down to the local bank and I can cash a dollar bill, can't I?
Oh, well, you can go into any colony of Great Britain and cash a check. That doesn't mean you're in an independent nation.
Would you trace for me the colony of Great Britain to the United States and the banks? If I put a Federal Reserve note in the bank today, how can I say or how can you tell me that's a part of a colony of Great Britain?
Well, you see, we started out as a colony of Great Britain, and then presumably we won political independence in the American Revolution. But you see, the American Revolution was not against the bank. The American Revolution was against King George III. So we won against King George III, but we didn't win against the Bank of England, of which King George III was a major stockholder. So King George lost this wonderful colony over here, but he retained the banking control and continued to get his interest and his profits from his American colony, just as before.
Okay, let's go from King George to the Federal Reserve. What happened in between? Because there was some time in there, and some people say that Andrew Jackson was one of the best presidents this country ever had. Could you tell us about him, and what did he do in regard to banking?
Well, you see, immediately after the Revolution, when we had our wonderful independence and we could have the 4th of July and shoot off firecrackers and still pay interest to the Bank of England, which no one seemed to mind because they didn't know about it. And so Andrew Hamilton reestablished the Bank of England presence in the United States of America immediately after the Revolution, called the First Bank of the United States, which Jefferson strongly opposed. And when Jefferson became president, he refused to renew the charter of this foreign central bank, the First Bank of the United States, so it went out of existence. And in revenge for that, England declared war on us, and we had the War of 1812, which was simply a banking war. Of course, you won't read that in any history book in England or in the United States. They tell you that American seamen were being impressed by the British Navy. They would stop American ships and impress American seamen. And this was the occasion of the war. Well, it had nothing to do with it. It was simply the Bank of England said, we're going to punish the United States for refusing to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States. So anyway, the First Bank of the United States disappeared, and then Nicholas Biddle, an agent of James Rothschild of Paris, chartered a second Bank of the United States. And it was doing quite well until Andrew Jackson came along and he said to the bankers, you are a nest of vipers, and by God, I will rout you out. And so he did. He removed all of the government deposits from the Second Bank of the United States in 1836, which caused it to collapse. And in revenge, the Bank of England suspended all American paper, which caused the first Great Depression in the United States, called the Panic of 1837. That was strictly a banker's panic, and of course then the Rothschilds came in and bought up American securities at 1 cent on the dollar and established a great many of the great American fortunes, including J.P. Morgan.
But Andrew Jackson himself, you would credit him with at least taking a stand against this banking monopoly that is destroying his America.
Well, he was a general and a patriot and an American, and to him the bankers were Satan incarnate. They were robbing and looting this country. They were oppressing the people. They were causing financial depression and widespread suffering, and he said, I'm going to go after them, and he did. Unfortunately, the history books do not tell you why he did anything that he did, so the American children go to school and they have no idea what all this was about. Neither do the college students. Neither do the graduate college students.
You know, I saw a beautiful statue of Andrew Jackson not long ago up in Jacksonville, Florida. And a lot of people don't realize that the state of Florida, the first governor was Andrew Jackson.
Yes, that's right.
And the city of Jacksonville was named after this wonderful patriot and hero of the American middle class. Now, let's go a little bit further. You mentioned the word Rothschilds. Where did that name come from, please?
Well, there was a family of moneylenders in Frankfurt, Germany, named Bauer, which means peasant. And why these moneylenders were trying to call themselves peasants, I don't know, because none of them had ever been near a plow in their life. And so they were moneylenders, and they needed some way of advertising their business. And so the founder of this dynasty, the House of Rothschild, put up a red shield above his door so that people who came from various parts of Europe to change money with him could find it. And so after a few years, people didn't know who Bauer was, but they knew the Rothschild. The red shield was Rothschild. And so he simply began to call himself Rothschild.
Okay, now he died eventually, but did he leave a dynasty of some sort? I mean, how did this happen?
Well, he left 5 sons who were very well trained by this man, who by that time had become the outstanding moneylender of Europe due to a very peculiar circumstance. King George III and the Bank of England wanted to punish the American colonists for being so obstreperous and for refusing to give all of their profits to the Bank of England from their income. And so when they rebelled, then the British Army did not really want to fight their American cousins. So King George said, well, I've got to get somebody else to fight this war. I need some mercenaries, some hired soldiers. And over in Germany, the Elector of Hesse, a German province, had a very well-trained group of soldiers called the Hessians. And so he said, well, I'll rent these out to you, King George, who was a German himself, by the way, a Hanover. And he said, for $5 million, you can have this nice army. And so George said, all right. And then when the Elector of Hesse got this $5 million, he said, what am I going to do with it? And they said, well, there's a very good investor and financial advisor named Meyer Amschel Rothschild there in Frankfurt. So he let Meyer Amschel lend out this money, which was the biggest chunk of capital in Europe at that time, $5 million. And so Amschel spread it around, and pretty soon he brought back $20 million to the elector, who was very pleased, and kept $5 million for his efforts. So now he was a monetary power himself, and of course the Elector of Hesse let it be known that if you had money to invest, put it in Meyer Amschel's hands. So when Meyer died, he had 5 sons, and so they dispersed themselves over the 5 capitals of Europe. And Nathan went to London, James went to Paris, and so forth.
This is the quickest way to sharpen your memory. Look at these 2 brain scans. They both look young, strong, and healthy, right? But only one belongs to a young adult.
So they now had total control of the monetary resources of Western civilization, the entire continent of Europe. And they had developed some very interesting techniques. One was that the courier went from James in Paris to Nathan Mayer in London, and he wanted $1 million in gold. So he would give him a note saying, I want $1 million in gold, but he would not sign it. So if someone came into a Rothschild office, a courier and said, I have a request here for $1 million, it's signed James Rothschild, and Nathan knew it was fake because they didn't sign their communications.
Little trickery even then, but I think good little trickery.
Well, you live and learn, you know.
That's right. So we're talking about the New World Order. In the New World Order, we had the war with England, and that was the Revolutionary War. And there was the banking system that was set up, and that was Alexander Hamilton that set it up originally after that. Thomas Jefferson then went ahead and decided this was not good for the American people. And then after that, we had the War of 1812, and then we come to Andrew Jackson, and he fought the bankers again, and then we have the Rothschilds, and their dynasty is building. Tell us about the Rothschilds now, how they enter into the picture as far as, shall we say, the Federal Reserve is concerned.
Well, the Rothschilds realized early on you don't make any money by lending somebody $200 to buy a used car. They only dealt with governments and with the kings of Europe, and they only handled government loans because that's where the big money was. And you see, they realized it was a sure thing, because if you lent money to a government and they didn't repay you, then they would never get any more money. And they always needed money for wars and for to build Versailles and so forth. To be a king means you spend a lot of money. You're a big spender. And they could always tax their people enough to repay the Rothschilds their money, so they had nothing to worry about. And so by 1880, the Rothschilds really owned all of Europe, and they owned a large part of the United States secretly, because they always advertised and promoted the idea that the Rothschilds had no activities in the United States, and they did not, because they worked through August Belmont, who was their named representative, and they also worked through J.P. Morgan and Kuhn Loeb Company, which were their secret representatives. And by 1896, these two Rothschild firms, J.P. Morgan and Kuhn Loeb, owned 96% of all the railroad mileage in the United States.
Wow, talk about a monopoly there.
And that's in congressional reports. I got that right out of, most of my work, by the way, comes from congressional reports.
So you do researching on congressional reports, and how far do you back to this research information go, Eustace?
About 5,000 years.
5,000 years. We're talking to Eustace Mullins, ladies and gentlemen, and we're talking about the New World Order. Well, tell us then, the Rothschilds, tell us about the Federal Reserve. Now they've become involved in the Federal Reserve, and what about Soviet Russia? How did Soviet Russia come into this New World Order situation, Mr. Mullins?
Well, Soviet Russia was always part of the world order, and in fact the Soviet Empire, the evil empire, which we heard so much about, and in the 1950s we were digging atom bomb shelters in our backyards to protect us from this catastrophe which was going to happen at any moment, and which was good for the contracting industry, but it didn't really help anybody as far as avoiding atomic bombs. So the Soviet Empire came about because of greed and envy. Now, communism, of course, is based on hatred, greed, and envy. But what people don't realize is that the Russian Revolution came about because of the greed and envy of King George V of England for his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who happened to be the richest man in the world. And when you're the richest man in the world, the consequence is all the people who are not quite as rich hate you and wish they could get their hands on your money. So the Rothschilds told King George V, they were all around him as his advisors in London, they said, look, let's go after Nick and get his dough. And George said, well, I'm game. And so the Rothschilds started the communist movement in Russia. And so they murdered the Tsar and his family, and took his gold, which was sent to Paris and to Kuhn Loeb Company in New York and the other Rothschild offices, London and so forth. And some of this money, by the way, these Rothschild banks used to buy the original stock of the Federal Reserve System in 1914. That was all bought with the Tsar's money, and so the Romanov heirs, such as are still alive, are the real owners of our Federal Reserve System. And so, as I say, they murdered the richest man in the world, took all of his money. Well,
what year was that, by the way? What year was that when they murdered the Tsar?
Well, that was 1918. They had the Communist Revolution in 1917, and the first thing they did was go in and loot the whole country. They took all the money, and so the result was the new Soviet Empire had no operating capital, and they couldn't tax anybody because they had murdered all the people who owned anything. So you couldn't go out and tax the peasants to keep the country running. So they sent up cries of anguish, and people all over the world responded. Woodrow Wilson, our president, he made a speech to Congress in which he said, "It is our duty to help these noble murderers in Moscow," in so many words. And so he first sent them $25 million of his personal war fund, voted to him by Congress to prosecute World War I. And he sent Elihu Root, who, by the way, wrote the charters of all the major foundations. Elihu Root was a lawyer of whom J.P. Morgan said, when I call in lawyers and I want something done, they give me a lot of reasons why it cannot be done. He said, when I call in Elihu Root says, what do you want me to do? And I tell him, and he does it. So that's why he became the lawyer for the big bankers in this country.
Now, tell me, Eustace, because there's a lot of people that have said that the banking themselves, that the communist revolution was started on Wall Street. Is that a true fact or not, Eustace Mullins?
It's absolutely true. All of the money for Wall Street, for the Bolshevik Revolution, came from Wall Street, really from Rothschild firms, but it would have been too obvious if the Rothschilds of London were sending all their money over to Russia to help the communists. So they did it through their favorite patsy, which is the American government. And they even formed a special firm on Wall Street in 1916 to finance the communist revolution in Russia, which was called American International Corporation. And its directors were Percy Rockefeller, the richest men in the United States, including a financier named George Herbert Walker, who just happened to be the grandfather of George Bush, our president.
Now, how does this George Bush fit in now? George Herbert Walker Bush, the former president, or about to be president of the United States, formerly anyway, how does he fit in with his father, and was it his father and the Rockefellers and the Harrimans and the Brown brothers? Did they all work together as far as this New World Order is concerned?
Well, the New World Order is a group of insiders. It's sort of an international mafia, and they either work together or they get eliminated. I mean, these people have to cooperate because the death sentence is automatic if you don't. And you don't say, I'm going my way, to heck with you, because if you go your way is straight down. And so George Bush was like a lot of scions of these world order families. That is, he was unemployable. I mean, if he came in to be interviewed and there were 8 people there, he would be the 8th one that you would hire if you had to hire 8 people. And, you know, Lyndon Johnson...
He should have had 7 others when he was running for president of the United States.
Well, it's too bad it didn't. Lyndon Johnson was quite a perceptive guy. He was a Texas redneck, and he came to Washington and he looked at all these bright young men at the Central Intelligence Agency who were from the wealthiest families in the United States. They were there as a lark. They wanted to play James Bond, and their families...
You won't hear any doctors talking about this, but there's something called lung glue. Lung glue is the real reason people still struggle to breathe, even years after quitting smoking. What is lung glue? Scientists have discovered an invisible toxin that hardens mucus inside your lungs, making it impossible to cough out, no matter how hard you try. This hardened mucus sticks like glue, and the more the mucus builds...
Sorry about that, guys. I thought I paid my bill. We'll go back here. Just bear with me, folks.
Buckley was hired by the CIA when he finished at Yale, Skull and Bones. We're talking about the Brotherhood of Death here, the Skull and Bones crowd.
Sorry for the technical difficulties, but just to catch you up, do you understand what this guy is saying? This is about as in-depth as it gets right here. This guy was no joke, and if you read his books, then you'll quickly understand what's going on. And it's pretty incredible that basically everything you know is a lie.
Which Bill Buckley and George Bush and all of the partners at Brown Brothers Harriman were members of this Illuminati fraternity established in 1848 as the Russell Trust by Daniel Coit Gilman, who also, by the way, later set up the charitable foundations. Gilman was on the board of all of these so-called charitable foundations, which were simply secret instruments of the world order.
So George became a member of the CIA. Matter of fact, he was CIA director in 1976. An interesting thing happened to Eustace in 76, and that was when he met one Saddam Hussein, who became involved in power in Iraq at the time. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, George was always a business partner of Saddam, and he claimed he didn't know him, so he deliberately, when he was on camera, he always mispronounced his name. He always called him Saddam, as though he were trying to call him a sodomite, I don't know. But anyway, they have been business partners that goes way back. And so Saddam himself, you know, is worth about $10 billion. He's a player on the world scene. And that's why when George was ranting about getting rid of the new Hitler, and he sent our army over there to do it, they walked away, leaving Saddam Hussein in total control. I don't think he ever heard a gunshot fired during that entire Iraqi war. But to get back to George, he didn't start out with the CIA. He started out as an agent, a secret agent of the CIA, who was running his own oil company called Zapata Oil Company. And, you know, George, when he wanted a name for his company, he wanted a name that really represented what he believed in. So he didn't call it the Thomas Jefferson Oil Company, and he didn't call it the George Washington Oil Company. He looked down at Mexico, where you had a communist revolutionary named General Emiliano Zapata. And Emiliano was quite a bloodthirsty guy. His idea of a good time was to go into a village and line up all the women and children and shoot them. So George said, this is my kind of guy. So he named his oil company Zapata Oil Company, which showed the kind of people that he would like to have around him. And the Zapata Oil Company was never anything but a front for the CIA. They did a lot of work in Mexico and in the Gulf of Mexico for the CIA. And of course, when you had the supposed attack against Castro to wipe out communism in Cuba, George was in on the planning, and of course they bought 2 ships to haul the fighters, freedom fighters, to Cuba. And they named one of them Barbara, after his wife, and they named the other ship Zapata, after his oil company. So George was pretty well inside all the way. And of course, they never intended to overthrow Castro. You see, when you set up a regime that you control, like in 1917, they set up the Bolshevik regime, and the American taxpayer supported the Soviet empire from 1917 right up till the time it collapsed. And the only reason it collapsed was that the United States was bankrupt. They couldn't send them any more money. So we destroyed communism by going bankrupt ourselves, which I guess is one way of doing it.
You said one time, Eustace, that the Russians have been trying to make it through the winter every winter since its inception of the communism, and we've been helping them through the winter.
So there's communism for you in a nutshell. It's basically stealing other people's money and giving it to another nation. Surprise, surprise.
Well, the guy who helped him first was Herbert Hoover. After they sent him money, Wilson sent him money, and then they said, we don't have any food. So Herbert Hoover, the great engineer who was a Rothschild employee, after he had been banned for life from the London Stock Exchange as a thief and an embezzler, and the Rothschilds said, boy, we want this guy on our side.
Sure.
So they hired him as a director of Rio Tinto Zinc, one of their family firms. And so then in 1916, the Germans said, look, we can't fight any longer. We don't have any more money. We don't have any more food. And we don't have any more coal. So the Rothschilds said, well, hang on, and we'll see what we can do. So they got Herbert Hoover to inaugurate the German Relief Commission. But since we were at war with Germany, they couldn't well call it the German Relief Commission, so they called it the Belgian Relief Commission. And the Belgians were suddenly were astounded to find out that they were all starving when they had just had the best crop year they ever had. But anyway, the Belgian Relief Commission, which, by the way, was one of the greatest thieveries in the world, Herbert Hoover and his pals who ran this operation, they all came out of it multimillionaires. And Herbert Hoover several times remarked very sourly, some of these days, some prying SOB is going to want to look at our books. Well, no one ever did, and they kept their money. But after the Belgian Relief Commission, which kept the Germany in the World War I for 2 more years and brought a very satisfactory conclusion. Then they called on Herbert to help them out again. They said, look, the Bolsheviks are starving. They've shot all the peasants and the farmers, and they have no food. So Herbert Hoover then organized Russian relief, and he went over and saved the Bolsheviks from total collapse. And somehow, after this, he became known as a great anti-communist, which just shows you what, when you control the media, you can sell any story that you want.
Absolutely. And one of the things that was so sad for me to read about, of course, was when the Bolsheviks did go into the Ukraine, and they did kill so many people. They starved between 6 and 8.
When you control the media, you can sell any story you want. 100% correct. A lot of people will say, oh, because there was propaganda in Nazi Germany, which there was. But we have the biggest propaganda machine in history, is what people don't understand. We have better technology than they did. I mean, come on. You can't see it? All you got to do is look at your phone. All you got to do is turn the TV on. It's constant news, non-stop. 4K high definition. Wake up.
Million Ukrainians out. And this is the end result of what the America has done, because America itself, this government, not the country, I don't believe the country, Eustace, I don't believe the patriotic people in the country, but this government was responsible for funding situations like this, weren't they?
Oh, very much so.
Exactly.
And in fact, this
Did
great...
you see what he just said? Not the people. This is how governments hide their butt. This is how corrupt people in governments that want to get away with murder literally cover their butt. They use various things, and one of them is religion. Well, what are you, anti-Semitic? I can't get away with all my murderous deeds and manipulating people, destroying people, doing all this stuff. That's why I said I had to preface what I said. I don't have anything against ordinary Jewish people. If you're an ordinary Jewish person, you want to go to synagogue, you want to live your life, take care of your family, okay, do it in peace. I love you. Because I know Jewish people, and for the most part, they're really good people. And I don't say that to like cover my butt. It's the reality. Is there bad ones doing things at a government level is what I'm saying? Yes. And so if you say that, then automatically you are completely crazy and against all of them. That's how they're hiding. Get it?
Great massacre of the Russian peasants in the early 1930s was deliberately suppressed by Walter Duranty, the chief correspondent in Russia of the New York Times, and he dictated what would be allowed to be sent back to this country. They totally suppressed this so that Franklin D. Roosevelt, as a principal plank of his platform in 1933, that it was to give official diplomatic recognition to Soviet Russia so we could send them even more money, of taxpayers' money, than they'd been doing before. So, but they couldn't do this if the press was going to print a story that 10 to 12 million Russians had been murdered by Stalin. So the story was completely suppressed, and in fact the American people today really don't know whether to believe it or not. There have been several books out about it by Robert Conquest, which are very good, totally documented, but they don't get much play in the media.
Mm-hmm. You know, they had a movie at one time on PBS, but PBS refused to run it in most of its affiliate.
Another example I want to give, for example, I'm Christian, and I also understand like the Jewish side of things because I've studied it. But if I tell you I think the Catholic Church is corrupt, does that mean that I'm anti-Christian now? No. If I'm Cuban and I tell you Fidel Castro is a piece of shit, does that mean I hate all Cubans? So in other words, we got to stop seeing things in this black and white ultimatum paradigm. This is what they're programming us into.
and that was Harvest of Despair.
Oh, yes.
It was a television, I think it was about an hour and a half long, or a couple hours anyway, but it showed exactly what happened and the terrible human tragedy that this government, the United States of America government, was involved in by the fact that they supported communism in other parts of the world, namely the Soviet Union at that time. You know, it's interesting to me, Eustace, that over 70 million people have been killed by communism, many by their own people, and we still support governments like that. How can this happen, Eustace Mullins?
Well, you mentioned public broadcasting system, PBS, which to most people in the know, they call it the phony. They say PBS stands for the phony broadcasting system because they're a bunch of goofy left-wingers and homosexuals, and they're so relentlessly far left in their orientation that occasionally some congressman or some senator will point out, has PBS ever...
I've been taking Digesticare for 3.5 years. It's a wonderful product.
Sorry about that, guys.
Greatly
published any or run anything which was of a conservative nature, and of course the answer is no. And whenever someone in Washington points this out, why they would have to point it out, I don't know, because all you got to do is turn this phony broadcasting system on and you can see it for yourself. But whenever a congressman mentions this, they immediately denounce him in the entire press as a hate monger, guy who wants to suppress freedom of speech. And of course there is no freedom of speech on the phony broadcasting system because it's totally left-wing.
Now, we have a number of people, different types of people, different nationalities in this world. We had World War I, we had World War II, we had South Korean War, and then we had Vietnam. Should we have fought any of those wars, Eustace Mullins? Was there a real reason? And what was the end result of us being involved in, say, World War I and World War II?
Well, John, you have to understand what wars are. Wars are carefully staged productions. Now, these are all carefully staged, and they did what they were supposed to do, and they had a good audience, and so I think they were successful. But to say that these wars were about anything, that they had some particular philosophy of government opposing another philosophy of government is total nonsense. These were world order productions, and as I say, they were carefully staged. Both sides were set up to perform in a certain manner, and the outcome was always predetermined. In other words, you were looking at a stage production which you had already seen many times, a sort of a soap opera, and you knew how it was going to come out before it even started.
Now, Eustace, you're a veteran, and I'm a veteran. And I know when I went in the service, I was just about as patriotic as anybody could possibly be. That's the way that I felt anyway. And, you know, I saw things in the service, Eustace Mullins, that would lead me to believe that I still love my country, don't get me wrong, but it's this government that I don't think that I'd ever fight for again, because you just kill a lot of people, raise a lot of debt, raise a lot of taxes. I come back, the people are far worse off than they ever were before, and we seem to be enslaving ourselves. Is this true, or am I imagining things?
Oh, you're not imagining anything. In fact, I was in the Air Force during World War II, and I can't say that we were very patriotic, because during our basic training down here at Miami Beach, we were marching along, drilling in the morning, and we were singing to cadence, and we would sing, I hate wall, Eleanor hates wall, my dog Paula hates wall. And all we did was make fun of these phonies in Washington, you see. So I can't say that we were that patriotic. And over in England, whenever Winston Churchill came on, Evelyn Waugh, one of the most famous English novelists, pointed out in his memoirs that whenever Winston Churchill came on the radio while they were sitting around in their officers' club with one of his great speeches, they would sit around, they would laugh themselves to tears at this old drunk, you see. So when you say patriotism, I don't know how much patriotism there really was.
Tell us a little bit more about Winston Churchill. Was he bought and paid for?
Yes, Winston Churchill at times spoke out against communism. You know, he was a son of a syphilitic named Randolph Churchill, but whether apparently he didn't inherit the taint, but anyway, he was always a little goofy, and he was really a drunk. If he didn't have his 2 quarts of whiskey a day, he really didn't know where he was. And during the Great Blitz of London, most people thought he was, being very brave, staying in London during the Blitzkrieg.
Oh, that's where his 2 quarts of whiskey were.
Well, he was 8 stories down. They built him a special shelter, 8 stories down in the ground, a very comfortable room, and he was liberally supplied with whiskey. And in fact, they used to show this room to tourists after the war. But a historian named David Irving did a new biography of Winston Churchill, and he was an establishment historian. He was published by Macmillan, which is owned by the Rothschilds, and so he sent this new biography of Churchill to the offices of Macmillan, in which he went in at some length about how this old drunk slept out the war in this special room underneath London. And they said, "Oh no, you can't print that." And he said, "Well, that's the key to my whole biography." And so they said, "Well, goodbye," and they refused to print the book. And he finally got it out on his own, and he started touring and lecturing on some of his discoveries, with the result that Canada officially banned him from entering Canada as a very dangerous person, because he was telling the truth about Winston Churchill. And they have riots when he speaks, and it's all very exciting.
We're talking with Eustace Mullins today, ladies and gentlemen, and this is the book. It's The World Order and it's about our secret rulers. It's extremely, extremely important that we understand what is happening in America today, because we do have a $4 trillion debt. The nation is on its way down. We've become a...
Well, Bob, today we're at 14 trillion. Imagine that. And then people wonder why we're 14 trillion in debt. It was designed that way. And if you say that, because nobody's privy to the real information, oh, this guy's crazy. Anyways, if you like this type of content, like and subscribe. Give me a like. Give me a subscribe. And we're going to go into part 2 of this endeavor right here. And then we're going to also cover other people. I hope you guys have a blessed night. God bless. Take care.